I found the silver cloud on a rainy Tuesday, half buried under a blanket of ivy and shame in a storage yard 2 towns over. It looked like a grandpa's photograph left out in a storm. Once immaculate lines dulled by rust, the chrome gone dull, the spirit of ecstasy drooped like a tired prom date. I didn't plan to rescue it. I just went to look, because something about that long hood and that sad grill tugged at me the way old songs tug at the back of your throat. The yard owner shrugged and said the owner had skipped town and the bank wanted it gone. The price was a number with 3 zeros that still made me wince, but I wrote the check. When I rolled it onto my trailer, neighbors slowed their cars to stare like it was a celebrity. I called one of my friends who knows vintage machines and said, "I bought a Rolls Royce that's dying." He laughed and asked when I planned to build a museum. Back home, the driveway turned into a stage. I dragged a tarp off the hood and the smell hit me. Oil, dust, forgotten perfume. The interior was a time capsule. Leather that had once been soft as a secret was now cracked. The wood veneers spidered with tiny fractures, the carpets matted. The engine bay looked like a mechanic's nightmare in sepia. Yet even with the wear it had dignity, the way a war hero has wrinkles, but still stands straighter than most. I didn't have much more than stubbornness and a toolbox my dad had left me. I started small. I cleaned. I learned to be patient with screws that resisted like stubborn relatives. I cataloged parts, photographed everything, labeled the jars with a shaky Sharpie. I read manuals that sounded like poetry, British timbers and precise tolerances, screws that had names I'd never heard. I taught myself to love the rhythms of the work, the satisfying click when a bolt finally gave, the hum when the lathe polished a chrome trim back to a whisper of shine. Word spread. People brought me cups of coffee, old magazines with classifieds for parts, a rusty badge from another Rolls as a good luck offering. A retired mechanic from down the street spent a week under the car, showing me how to read an oil stain like a palm reader. He'd say, "Look here, the leak tells you where it hurt the most." That's when the silver cloud started to give up its secrets. The carburetor needed a rebuild, the cooling system a new heart, the leather needed a bath and a long talk. The more hands that worked on it, the more the neighborhood started to understand why I'd taken her in. Then HOA Karen noticed. Karen wore a necklace of outrage and a clipboard like a scepter. She was the type of person who knew the rules and loved the rules because they were another place to stand in judgment. She lived a few houses down and had opinions about the color of mulch, the day you could put out a grill, and apparently, what cars belonged on a driveway. I heard the first complaint in the form of a polite note under my door. "Dear neighbor, a vehicle of this type is not compliant with Section 7.4 of our covenants. Please remove it." I laughed at first. Who enforces a covenant against a classic car? The silver cloud sat like an old monarch, regal and unbothered by bylaws. But Karen wasn't placated. She started showing up in the mornings with pamphlets about community standards and later, with a camera. One afternoon, she marched over with a smile that had been sharpened by bureaucracy. I greeted her with a wrench in my hand and oil on my jeans. "This is a hazard," she said. "It's a project," I said. "It's unsightly," she said. "It's restoration," I said. She sniffed like a judge at a tasting and said, "You should be considerate of the neighborhood. We're thinking of filing a complaint." There are ways to deal with people like Karen. Humor, avoidance, or patience. I tried humor. I tried to explain the history and the beauty, and I invited her to see the work. She declined, then circulated a petition. That was when the heat turned up. The HOA's first letter arrived printed on crisp paper and wrapped in the kind of passive-aggressive language that feels like a small mind trying to sound big. "Remove the vehicle immediately," it said. "Failure to comply will result in fines." The fines were a slow, cruel drip. I tacked the notice to my garage door, because if art can be defined as making a person look small on purpose, this was a modern painting. I considered giving in. Sell the car, cut my losses, and let the neighborhood sleep. But something in me is allergic to surrender, especially when something alive with potential sits under your hands and asks to be saved. So I doubled down. I turned the restoration into a story. I live-streamed small parts of the work, not because I wanted likes, but because stories bring people into the room and people in the room don't sign petitions. I narrated the cleaning, the first time the engine turned over with a reluctant cough, the polishing of the chrome until it matched the sky. I treated the silver cloud like a character you slowly learn to love. Comments came in from strangers who grew attached to the car's slow rehabilitation. Local reporters called. A small article appeared in the lifestyle section about a neighbor restoring a classic and how community spaces can create connections. The article painted me as a local eccentric, which in suburban terms is almost a compliment. Karen didn't like that. She called the HOA board and arranged for them to come with their clipboards and their sense of righteousness. They parked two neat SUVs at the curb and approached my driveway like prosecutors entering a courtroom. The board president said the same things the letter had said, but louder and with the authority of a coffee-stained binder. We listened. I showed them my permits, the restoration plans, photographs of the Silver Cloud's history. One of the board members fiddled with his pen and said, "But it's a car that attracts attention. It may disrupt neighborhood peace." I thought of the old men in the coffee shop who'd stopped by to see the progress, of the kids who kept asking when it would be finished, of the woman down the block who'd said she cried when she saw the leather come back to life. Disrupting peace is not the same thing as bringing a community together. But HOA logic does not bend easily around human nuance. Days became weeks. The fines piled like unwanted leaves. Neighbors who had once smiled offered neutral nods, as if bribed by civility into silence. My mailbox filled with notices, with reminders that the community had rules, and that rules were important. The Silver Cloud's progress slowed because money went to pay fines and not parts. That's when I realized this would be a fight not only mechanical, but also legal. I called a lawyer who specialized in property and community disputes, because when Karen uses a covenant like a sword, you need someone who knows how to deflect it. The lawyer read the HOA paperwork and said there was wiggle room, especially for restoration projects that kept the property within acceptable safety regulations. We filed for a temporary injunction to stop fines while the case was evaluated. The injunction was a small victory. It felt like finding a missing tool at the bottom of a toolbox. But Karen didn't back down. She upscaled her campaign. She began circulating a rumor that the car was not mine, that I had stolen it, that I was running some kind of clandestine storage yard out of my driveway. Rumors are the gasoline of petty vendettas. They spread fast and smell worse than actual gas. One night, someone flattened all four tires. The next morning, I found the Silver Cloud sitting on bricks, dignified even with its wheels missing. That felt like an escalation beyond HOA theatrics. I filed a police report. The cops were sympathetic but puzzled by the intensity of suburban wars. The tires were replaced, and I installed a simple security camera that recorded a series of fuzzy images and the shadow of a woman with a clipboard. A confrontation was inevitable. I knocked on Karen's door. She opened it with the defensiveness of someone who believes righteousness is a shield. I told her I was tired of the games. I said, "This car is more than metal to me. I'm restoring it, and it's safe. And if the community has an issue with that, let's sit down and talk." She replied with the calibration of someone who had rehearsed outrage for a decade. "The car belongs to the neighborhood," she said. "You can't just put something like that on public display without consulting the proper channels." So we brought the community together in the only way that would make Karen uncomfortable. We organized an open day. I invited everyone, including Karen. We cleaned the driveway, we set folding chairs, and we made coffee. I displayed the documentation, purchase papers, restoration permits, the photos of the engine, and testimonials from local businesses that had helped with parts. I let people touch the leather and smell the polish and ask questions. The children clambered over the running boards. The elderly patted the hood as if blessing it. A few neighbors admitted they'd been curious and embarrassed to say so. Karen showed up with a folder and a look like a cat that had been denied a nap. She asked to speak. She took the mic I handed her because, to her credit, she liked being heard. She said the things she always said about standards and value and precedent. Then something shifted. An older man rose from the back and told a story about his father taking him for a ride in a Silver Cloud when he was a boy. A young woman said the restoration reminded her of her grandfather's small acts of rebellion. The conversation turned from checklist to memory. The HOA softened its stance. Maybe public sentiment nudged them. Maybe they were embarrassed at the tires incident. Maybe they realized that a community is built by messy, beautiful things more than by bylaws. But Karen didn't vanish. She adapted. She began to attend the live streams, and, oddly, she asked questions about the leather cleaner I used. When the Silver Cloud finally rolled out of my driveway, polished to the memory of moonlight, the block gathered like it was a holiday. We drove it slowly down the street. not as a show of defiance, but as an offering. People lined their driveways like it was a parade. The kids squealed. Someone somewhere popped champagne and handed me a paper cup. Karen stood on her porch, not applauding, but not scowling either. She lifted a hand in something that might have been resignation or approval, or maybe just the necessity of letting small towns rearrange their rules around passion. I entered her into the car's story because every restored thing needs witnesses. I took it to a show where classic cars stood like sentinels in neat rows, each one telling a different tale of neglect turned into care. Judges rubbed their chins and murmured about lines and restoration quality. The Silver Cloud didn't win the top prize, but it won something better, an audience that asked me about the neighbors who had helped, the nights under the hood, the fight with an HOA that nearly turned mean. They wanted to know about community, about why we save the old things. I told them what I had learned. Restoration is not just about metal and varnish. It's about memory and patience and the stubborn hope that beauty can be coaxed back with hard work. The story spread in small echoes. A magazine photographer wrote a piece not about the car alone, but about the way a single project had brought a block together, in spite of an organizer who loved order more than people. Karen was mentioned, as she should have been, because every good story benefits from an antagonist who's complicated. There were consequences. The HOA rewrote some rules to be clearer about temporary projects and safety standards. I paid some fines before the injunction because I'm not an idealist with pockets of unlimited cash. I also paid the mechanic who worked in the rain, bought parts from a shop that had waited years to see a silver cloud again, and gave rides to a few elderly neighbors who'd always wanted to feel what it was like to ride in something with a carriage's dignity. Later, on a quiet evening, I polished the hood and watched the house lights blink on across the street. The work had changed me. It taught me how to be meticulous, patient, and fierce when it counted. It taught me how restoration is part of civic life, that saving something beautiful can be an act of defiance against the small cruelties of neighborly politics. And it taught me how a single car can carry the stories of the many hands that touched it. If you ever find a ruined thing and feel the tug, don't count the rules until you know the worth. There will be people like Karen who prefer order to messiness, and that's not always bad. Rules help neighborhoods not burn down. But there are also moments when rules need a little human warmth shoved back into them, like a stubborn key turned in an old lock. The Silver Cloud sits in my garage now, its engine a soft purr that sounds like contentment. Sometimes I take it out for a slow drive at dusk, when the light makes the chrome look like a ribbon of water. People wave. Sometimes Karen is among them, hands folded as if she's measuring the world and finding it slightly off from what she expected. Once she called me to ask where I had taken the upholstery for cleaning. She wanted the number. I gave it to her. Restoration is not a simple victory parade. It's late nights, small betrayals, and the glory of a finishing touch that makes you want to cry. It's neighbors who turn into helpers and antagonists who end up asking for the upholsterer's phone number. In the end, it's the sound of an old engine finding its voice again, and the sight of a community that argued its way to appreciation. If the Silver Cloud taught me anything, it's this: sometimes saving a thing saves you back. And sometimes the grumpiest people just need to see the shine to remember why they fell in love with beauty in the first place.